Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Damon Wilson. I'm Executive Vice President here at the Atlantic Council. I'm delighted to welcome you to Cyber Risk Wednesday, moving from bad to worse, looking back on 2014 and implications for 2015. I'm particularly delighted to welcome our panelists today, Dmitri Alperovitch, who's with us, co-founder and CTO of CrowdStrike and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Cyber Statecraft Initiative, and Shane Harris, senior correspondent at the Daily Beast, and author of a new book, which you've seen outside, At War, The Rise of the Military Internet Complex. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to those of you who are following us online today and encourage you to participate in the conversation via Twitter through hashtag ACCyber and at CSM Passcode, Christian Science Monitor Passcode. I'd also, this is our third installment of the Cyber Risk Wednesday, a series that's been dedicated to a deeper discussion and understanding of solutions to systemic cyber risk. Today's panel will analyze how events from the past year fit into trends in cybersecurity over the last decade and what implications they have going forward for this coming year. So just 1 year ago, many of you, as cyber experts, were calling 2013 the year of the data breach, only to find that 2014 had far worse in store. Not only did this past year see massive intrusions at some of America's most trusted companies, but critical vulnerabilities that had gone undiscovered for years, affecting global email providers such as Gmail and websites such as Facebook and Yahoo. The Sony hack has generated much attention at the end of the year, but perhaps a far more troubling attack was reported just a couple of days ago when hackers struck a steel mill in Germany, disrupting systems to such a degree that a blast furnace could not be properly shut down, resulting in massive amounts of damage. This is the second confirmed instance of physical damage from a cyber attack. And in the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, Russia continues to employ cyber tactics to pursue its geopolitical aims and to exploit the space that lies between peace and war. Our panelists this afternoon will discuss the trends stemming from these incidents and others, including how the NSA's support to Iraq and Afghanistan has contributed to this offense-first age of cybersecurity. They'll extrapolate how recent events will impact the future of the internet for individuals and cyberspace as a whole. Today's event is a special one for the Atlantic Council because Passcode, the Christian Science Monitor's new section covering security and privacy in the digital age, just became our exclusive media partner for this Cyber Statecraft Initiative series of talks, Cyber Risk Wednesday. So we're delighted to launch this partnership with Passcode and work together to demystify cyberspace by focusing on the overlap between cybersecurity and traditional national security and international relations. We're very thankful for their support in helping to raise awareness on the important topics that the team is covering here. So I want to turn the floor over in just a moment, but let me say just a couple of words to introduce our panelists. Dmitri Alperovitch, as I said, is co-founder and CTO of CrowdStrike. He's leading the intelligence technology and CrowdStrike lab teams. A renowned computer security researcher, he's a thought leader in cyber security policies and Statecraft. He's also a senior fellow in the Cyber Statecraft Initiative, and we're thankful for your continuous support of the program, Dmitri. Shane Harris is an author and journalist who has written extensively about intelligence and national security. His book, At War, The Rise of the Military Internet Complex, explores the front lines of America's new cyber war. Shane's currently a senior correspondent at the Daily Beast, where he covers national security, intelligence, and cybersecurity, and his work has appeared in a range of publications and newspapers. And finally, our moderator today is our own Dan Chiu, Deputy Director of the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security. Dan recently joined our team after a distinguished career in the government, where he most recently served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development, where he led work in the Office of the Secretary of Defense on strategic planning with an emphasis on global trends. We're extremely grateful to these gentlemen for their contributions to the discussion. We hope to engage all of you in this discussion as well as the online audience. And with that, let me turn it over to you, Dan, and invite the panelists to the stage, please. Thank you.
Stairs. So welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. And first of all, let me just say I'm Very pleased to be here, but I am sitting in for my friend and colleague Jay Healy, who's the director of the Statecraft initiative, who's on travel, and I'm sure is disappointed to be missing this session because the opportunity to speak with Shane and Dmitri at this time and on this subject, I think, is going to be particularly interesting. Having spent several years inside the Pentagon thinking very hard about these issues, I think the imperative to have a clear and detailed public discussion about this is quite important. And so I was very pleased to read Shane's book, which is strongly recommended to all of you as being a very well-written piece that goes through quite a few key aspects of cyber challenges going forward. And it's a pleasure to meet Dmitri. I'm looking forward to working with him here at the Council and engaging with him on some of this discussion. So let me do one of the things I did a lot at the Pentagon. I ran an office called the Strategy Office, which was all about long-term perspectives. Let's put this into perspective. We heard the introduction that Damon gave us. It sure seems like things have gotten worse since 2013, not to mention over the past few years, both quantitatively and qualitatively. Tell us, do you think things are getting worse? And tell us what you think the most aspects of that are. Shane?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're looking just, I mean, we mentioned at the beginning some of the more higher profile data breaches of the past year. I mean, the Home Depot, Target, the retailer attacks. The breach at JP Morgan, I think, was hugely significant and scared a lot of people because banks were presumed to have some of the best security in the industry. And when a big company like that is shown to be quite vulnerable, and given how much it is spending on cybersecurity every year, that is pretty alarming as well. And sort of capping it off at the end of the year with the Sony attack, which was so interesting, is that this, you know, it's not unexpected that it would take something like the confluence of security in Hollywood to elevate this to a level where lots of people were paying attention to it. But the attack itself, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this, I don't think it was that atypical. I mean, I think companies are frequently victims of hackers who are stealing or corrupting their data or are making threats against them. Obviously, what made this different is it involved a high-profile Hollywood film, but it's sort of, I think, crystallized for a lot of people who maybe were not as familiar with what the landscape of the threats looks like, what is something that's actually quite a common occurrence. I think there's cause for hope, which we could get to maybe later as well, what I've seen, but yes, I mean, 2014, if it was possible, seemed to eclipse 2013, at least in my mind, in terms of the severity of the attacks and the urgency with which the government seems to be responding to them.
Dmitri, your thoughts?
Yeah, the trend certainly is not going in the right direction, whether you look at number of breaches, whether you look at the impact of breaches, or even the number of adversaries that are jumping into the space. You know, we used to talk just a few years ago, it was China, China, China. Now it's no longer the case. You know, you obviously have all the usual suspects, Russia, Iran, North Korea you worry about, but you know, we have some allies that are executing operations against us. We're talking during the break, South Korea is one that came out recently in some of the leaked documents as being targeting our infrastructure, and particularly our defense industry, and we've seen that for some time. So it's not just the enemies that we worry about, but with friends like these, who needs enemies? The thing that I think people are finally realizing, and I sort of said this back in 2011 timeframe when it was probably a little bit too early for most people to appreciate, and it's a phrase that's now been repeated often, is that there are two types of companies, those that know that they've been hacked and those that don't. At the time, I got some criticisms for making that statement. I think now most people appreciate that that's indeed the case. And what's, I think, changed over time is our visibility into these types of attacks has increased. It used to be that back in the 2010, 2011 timeframes, we still had a lot of breaches. Just most companies weren't aware that they've been breached.
So that raises an interesting question for both of you. Is it really that there are more incidences, or is there more awareness, both from a technical perspective in terms of our ability to detect them, or from more of a public awareness perspective in the amount of exposure, particularly when something like a Sony hack happens?
Yeah, I would say for sure Dmitri's company has a level of intelligence gathering and insight into that process to perhaps analyze that more directly, but from my perspective, it seems like it's both. I mean, there's an increase in breaches and certainly an increase in awareness as well. And you know, if you can go back to around, I guess it was 2010, when Google was compromised by hackers believed to be in China who had stolen some of its source code. And Google made the decision at that point to go public with that information and actually disclosed it right before they did to the Obama administration. And what was significant about that was not that a major company had been hacked, but that a major company was about to admit that it had been hacked. And it does seem that there has been somewhat of a trend since then for companies to be a bit more forthcoming about this. But I would suspect that while there is this growing awareness of the threat, there are many, many, many more companies that are being compromised who know it and aren't saying a word about it. Some of the high-profile ones like Target and Home Depot, I imagine, were impossible to hide, and certainly the Sony breach was as well. So a level of awareness going up as well. Now, whether that translates into companies defending themselves better, I think is an open question, and you probably would have a better insight into that. I suspect, yes, maybe a little bit more, but not a lot.
Well, you know, I agree that it is both, and one of the things that I think is changing is the appreciation on the part of more companies that you don't have to be a bank or a defense contractor to be hit. In fact, there was a statement from one of the security folks at Sony a few years ago saying that it's not likely that I'm going to be hit because I'm not in one of those industries. Well, the reality is, if you have something worth valuable to steal, someone's going to come after you. In fact, I've said this to companies a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but really there's some truth behind it, is that if you don't have anyone coming after you, you should revalue your business because it means you're not producing anything of value.
So it's both of these things, but Shane, you mentioned something that I think is very interesting. So companies are becoming more open about the challenges that they're facing. But let me link this to something you said before. So for example, we saw the JP Morgan attack, and JP Morgan is at least perceived to be, if not actually, one of the best at thinking about this issue, and presumably one of the best at having defenses in this area. So the more we hear about this, does that actually increase awareness in a positive way, in the sense that people will be more engaged on this issue and hopefully better prepared? Or are we creating a little bit of a vicious cycle where it's actually encouraging some of these types of activities, if even the best can be taken down?
Yeah, I don't know if it's more that it's encouraging them. I mean, I think that the nature of the
not on purpose.
No, sure. No, I see what you're saying. Is in other words, like, you know, are we drawing more targets on people, or are the bad guys more aware of the vulnerabilities than they were before, perhaps?
Yeah,
my suspicion with that would be probably not. I mean, the nature of the sort of the progression of we like to call the advanced persistent threat, which is frequently describing, you know, industrial espionage coming out of China, but it could be just described to a number of adversaries, is that they keep getting better faster than the defenses keep getting better. And so if there's anything, I think what's been remarkable to me to see in the more of the defensive side of this is how these companies like CrowdStrike and others have really, that space has become highly activated, and you're seeing more and more private defense experts coming forward to fill what is obviously a need in the private sector to defend against intruders, to defend their networks and their data, and companies realizing that the government is not going to do that job for them. You know, I mean, one of the things that's been fascinating, and the reporting on the Sony attacks, and I've been doing this some of myself, is what it appears is that, you know, we now know that the NSA had managed to penetrate networks in North Korea. I think probably had a fairly good sense of the scale and the volume of spear phishing campaigns and other attacks being directed at American companies. Maybe did not necessarily know exactly what was happening at Sony, but it seems like probably they didn't find out about it until the exfiltration of data started happening. It raises this question of, does the government have a responsibility to notify companies? Does it have a responsibility to more raise awareness about the threats so companies will go out and protect themselves? And it seems like the de facto policy is in that latter category, that the government is not going to go out and protect Sony. It's not going to protect companies that are not necessarily vital critical infrastructure. That then, by definition, leaves it to the companies to do a more aggressive and assertive job of protecting themselves. And that's, I think, what is creating the market for those kinds of services.
Well, you actually, I mean, if you look at the government agencies and their responsibilities in this field, there's no government agency that has responsibility to protect the commercial sector. You look at our Defense Department, its responsibility is to protect the .mil, the military networks. You look at, and NSA as well in that category. You look at DHS, they have responsibility to protect government, networks.gov, and critical infrastructure. There's no one out there that's responsible for protecting Sony. FBI does do notifications, does do investigations, but it's after the fact, not in a protective fashion. So we actually do not have a structure in place from a national security perspective to have the government be involved in actual beforehand protection. I would also add, in response to your question, that I think because of the increase in the publicity around these breaches, the public and many in the industry, I think, are getting a lot more desensitized to those sorts of events. So Shane is absolutely right. When Google occurred, and I led the investigation into that attack when I was at McAfee, it was unprecedented because you had a company that came out and said we've been attacked and released a bunch of information about it and ultimately blamed China. Now that's a daily occurrence almost. And it's yet another thing that we open up a newspaper and see yet another company. So I think the impact of those disclosures is diminishing. And to a certain extent, even in some cases becoming counterproductive, where I've heard from companies saying, well, if JPMC, who reportedly spends $250 million a year on security, is going to get compromised, what chance do I have? My entire company doesn't even make that much money, right, much less being able to spend it on cybersecurity.
Right. Has there been any impact of the more explicit attribution of some of these attacks in more recent years to that dynamic of trying to posture both in the private sector, but obviously from a broad societal perspective against cyber attacks?
I think there's become more awareness, certainly of the countries that are doing this, why they may be doing this. And to a certain extent, we're seeing companies react with a great deal of fear that they're now facing not just a teenager in a basement type of hacking stereotype, but the PLA or the FSB, and they're asking questions of, do I really stand a chance when I'm dealing with a major intelligence service of another country that has tremendous budgets and people and capabilities that they can bring to bear? And if anything, you look at the Snowden leaks and what's come out about the NSA's capabilities, and you extrapolate that to some of the countries like Russia and China that we know have similar capabilities, you start to appreciate the resources that are being brought to bear on companies by these countries in terms of being able to exfiltrate the intellectual property or launch disruptive attacks like the one we've seen at Sony.
One way it occurs to me that the question of how attribution is changing companies' response, and there's a little noticed story that came out of last year, the Justice Department's decision to indict 5 Chinese military officers for hacking. And these were part of a group that had been previously identified by private researchers operating out of China and attacking a slew of American corporations. It was treated a little bit, cynically when DOJ indicted them because these 5 individuals will never see the inside of a courtroom, and it was seen as a bit of a show to look tough on the part of the administration. But interestingly, one of the companies that was affected in that series of hacks, a company called Solar World, which manufactures solar parts and panels, decided to use this as a reason to ask the Commerce Department to initiate trade penalties and retribution against the Chinese. And in fact, there's a decision that's expected in that case that's going to come out this afternoon. And what it struck me is that if you now are at the point where the government is going to get into the business of definitively attributing attacks to individuals or organizations, that may in fact give companies some avenue to demand a recourse. Mm-hmm. And I don't know whether or not the administration sort of bargained for that when they did that they would create this path for a company like SolarWorld to come out and demand accountability. But if we're going to now enter the phase where the government, like with the Sony hack, is going to come out and definitively say it was those 5 people, it does strike me that companies would demand some response with that out of that information.
It's a great point because I think we are moving in this debate that we've been having for over a decade from describing the problem and trying to understand the problem to now we get it. We know who's doing this, why they're doing it, and asking the question, okay, what we're going to do about it. And some of the stories that have been coming out lately about what exactly occurred inside the administration when they were able to attribute very, very rapidly the Sony hack to North Korea. The reason they did not disclose this initially was because they didn't have the answer of what are we going to do in response to this. And only when they formulated the policy that, yes, we're going to come out and name them, and yes, we're going to follow up with sanctions and other things, that they decide to actually release their attribution publicly. And you look at the statements from the new NSA director, Admiral Rogers, he's talking about the need for deterrence, right? We've moved beyond just a realization that, hey, we can just field these attacks and accept them to, no, there needs to be repercussions. We need to send signals and draw red lines for these countries that certain things are not going to be accepted, and we will respond in a proportional fashion.
Yeah, and the idea that these responses now can come in through different means other than just in the cyber domain, whether it's through trade issues or commercial issues probably makes this both more complicated, but it adds some interesting tools to the chest as well. Okay, I'm just going to ask a couple more questions and then open it up to folks to join into the conversation. So one is, you notice how we've been talking here about cyber, and we've used the national security paradigm. We've talked about what Department of Defense and the government can do to protect American interests and entities and companies and so forth. When I was in the Pentagon, I found a couple of challenges that I'd like to get your opinion on. So one was thinking about national security challenges writ large, and not just thinking about the usual typical traditional military on military challenges, but really thinking quite open-mindedly, as we have to do in the Pentagon, about the range of challenges we could be facing. We've seen a lot of those emerging in things like the activities that the incursion of the Russians in Ukraine, and we've seen how they've been able to skirt kind of our traditional definitions of military threats and manage to still create real threats to our national security interests. Cyber, to me, was an incredible example of how something very different in terms of a threat to our national security involves such different aspects than we were used to dealing with in DoD, not the least of which was, of course, the public-private combination in those areas, the technical and non-technical aspects of it, technical as in the actual technical cyber aspects of it, then the non-technical implications of it in terms of whether it had financial implications or commercial implications. And it got quite complex quite quickly. But then, at least in the Pentagon, because we then put it in this kind of military context, and in particular we called it a military domain, we really simplified it into an offense-defense question and focused on those. To me, it seems much more complex than that, and I'm not going to pick on the title of your book because I think it's quite cool, the At War title. But is war really the best analogy for what we're seeing going on in cyber right now? Or is it really just a kind of a sliver of what we're seeing in a much more complex environment?
I think it's probably a component of it. I mean, and my book is very much focused on that component. Right. And I write a lot about the use of offensive cyber tactics in Iraq and elsewhere. But the war analogy starts to break down when we're talking about the fact that most of what is threatened in the internet space are private entities. I mean, 85% is the figure that's been thrown around for years of the network infrastructure in the U.S. is privately owned. We do not regulate the internet as a utility, but we talk about it as a strategic national asset that looks a lot like a utility. I think even our vocabulary for sort of how we sort of approach the problem of talking about the strategy of protecting that space hasn't really caught up with the threat either. I was careful in talking about the warfare aspects of this to be focusing on the military and the intelligence component. To your point, my fear is that by the government sort of defining cybersecurity largely through that lens, the government starts to make policy decisions that could fundamentally weaken security for all of us. And one of the things that I write about as a concrete example of this in the book is the collection of zero-day exploits, which has been very controversial. So these are exploits into computer systems that have, for which there is no known defense, that have not been patched yet. And the intelligence community and the military obviously have a need for this information to be able to conduct more of their intelligence gathering, their offensive mission. But there's an argument to be made that by collecting those vulnerabilities rather than disclosing them publicly and to the makers of technology, that you're broadly and fundamentally undermining security on the internet in the first place. And so I think that we, part of the problem for how we're sort of getting this balance right is because we've looked at this largely through this military intelligence sort of lens. And I look at the National Security Agency as being sort of a great example of where you have this conflict sort of encapsulated. On the one hand, here's an agency whose job it is to go out and break into computer networks and steal information and disrupt those networks. And on the other hand, plays a role in protecting computer networks in the United States. It's an offensive and a defensive mission that are fundamentally at conflict with each other, and it's all residing in one agency, and who is sort of the arbiter between those missions. Not to pick on NSA, but to the extent that we've kind of contextualized the whole cybersecurity debate within the context of a military and intelligence apparatus, I'm not sure that that's getting us further towards where we need to be, which is talking much more broadly and about that, because we are talking about a huge privately owned, largely, space that we're all using.
Right. Dmitri?
Yeah, I've become pretty disenchanted with the use of the word war myself, because we don't have people dying because of cyber attacks, and the number of instances where we've actually had true physical impact, you can count on the fingers of one hand. So most of what we see, over 95% of what we see is espionage. Right? Stealing of data, disruption like we saw at Sony has occurred in the past, but it's still actually pretty rare. Most hackers are not interested in being discovered. They're interested in getting access to the network and stealing data, whether it's a criminal group that's stealing financial data or an intelligence agency that's stealing national security secrets or trade secrets. So that's the vast majority of what we've been seeing. I think the Sony event was a game changer, at the risk of overusing that word, not in the way that the attack was conducted, because the elements of the attack, and there were essentially three that we saw. There's the initial intrusion and the theft of emails and other information. That happens every single day against numerous companies. The ultimate deployment of the wiper malware to disrupt and delete data from the network is more rare, but we've seen that before in the Middle East against oil and gas companies. We've seen that actually against Korean companies, banking institutions, government networks there continuously for the last 6 years or so from North Korea. So that's not unprecedented. And then the last piece, which I've argued actually has probably been the most damaging, is actually the taking of that information that was stolen and public leaking of that, right? So all the embarrassing emails and everything else that has come out in terms of business practices and who makes what, that could be hugely disruptive to the business for years to come, because all of that confidential information is now out in the open, and Scarlett Johansson can now negotiate a better salary for herself, right? And that has occurred in the past as well, primarily from hacktivist groups. But taken all together, the unprecedented thing here really was the fact that Sony, at least for in the movie theaters and even other studios, made a decision in December to pull the movie initially. And the really outrageous thing from my perspective was the fact that other movie studios decided that producing other movies in North Korea was now unacceptable, right? That we live here in America with the freedom of speech and First Amendment, and suddenly it's impossible to criticize a dictatorial regime. And I think that actually motivated the administration to say, you know what, it wasn't about the cyber attack, it was about the impact, and the impact on the freedom of expression that reserved us standing up for this and actually responding. And really, it's the first time that I've seen where you had a major organization like that being essentially brought to their knees and bended to the will of the adversary. Ultimately, the movie was released and we didn't have the impact, but it was certainly scary. And the thing that I really worry about is folks in Moscow, folks in Tehran that are looking at this and saying, wow, that was interesting. And if we want to impact U.S. policy or a policy of a particular company, that's sort of the blueprint.
So maybe we've passed a point here and have to start worrying about this. You mentioned before that you can count on one hand kind of the actual physical, cyber attacks with physical implications, but we're starting to count, right, as opposed to saying hasn't happened yet or it's only happened in very, very special circumstances. The story of the German foundry wasn't well covered here, frankly. Initially, I saw more stories in Europe than I did here prior to the holidays, I think. And just now,
we're busy with Sony.
We were busy, but this was significant. And only recently are we starting to talk some more about this. If this is a beginning of a trend, and we've talked about other vulnerabilities that we've been concerned about for quite some time, particularly associated with public utilities and others, are you concerned that that's also kind of the beginning of a new situation?
Yeah, I mean, those concerns have been expressed really since the discovery of Stuxnet, and the possibilities exist. But at the same time, I want to be cautious and not overhype the threat, because I remember many experts saying after Stuxnet was released, well, this is the beginning of a new era, and now we're going to see factories and power plants blowing up all over the place. That hasn't happened.
Right.
And I think the reason it hasn't happened is that the degree of sophistication that's required to pull off an attack like that, the degree of intimate knowledge of those systems and how to operate them, is still outside of the capabilities of most groups or even nation states, and you need both the capability and the motivation ultimately to execute it. So I don't think we're necessarily close to the beginning of the age where these types of attacks are a daily occurrence, but it's certainly a worrisome trend.
You worry a little bit about the frog boiling analogy, though, right? That we're starting to see some signs of it, and by the time we really notice it, it'll be significant change.
But what's interesting to me too is that there's always, absolutely, I agree with Dmitri, the risk of hyping it, and after Stuxnet, it was sometimes hard to know if that was occurring or not, and time would suggest that maybe it was a little hyped or overinflated. But then Admiral Rogers, the NSA director, comes out a few months ago in testimony and says, I won't get the exact quote right, but effectively says, I believe that during my watch, I will be dealing with some sort of catastrophic cyber event in the United States. And everyone just sort of stops and says, wait a second, are you sort of preemptively covering yourself so that in case it does happen, you can say, I warned you and I told you so? Or do you know something that we don't, and do you have cause to really believe this is true? And Admiral Rogers has spent his career in signals intelligence and cybersecurity. He ran cyber operations for the Navy. He's a very thoughtful guy. I would hope that he was not coming out and saying this if he thought it was a remote possibility. But what's interesting is that you're seeing sort of the level of sort of pointed concern from people who should know. Seems like it's sort of starting to go up. And the John Q. citizen in me wants to believe that it's just Washington and covering, and that's something that really bad is not in the offing. But it is interesting that more people are coming out and publicly stating this now, whereas that's when people like Mike Rogers talk, you sort of have to stop and take it seriously.
Did he clarify whether he would be the one causing that event against
Right,
our
exactly,
adversary?
exactly. Didn't say what happened here, right?
Yeah. We had the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence here earlier today who also raised a concern. Going to end on, hopefully, this part of the discussion on a high note, and then we'll get to the audience. Shane, you said you had some cause for hope as you look at the trends going forward. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think that the administration's response to the Sony attack has not been perfect. But I applaud the fact that we are trying to at least publicly formulate responses and start creating policy around what is an obvious problem that has not had great policy responses in the past. And one of the things I found extraordinary when I was researching my book is there is so much more information in the public domain today, largely coming from DoD. And written material and speeches that senior officials have given about how DoD particularly sees what the response should be to cyber threats. And I don't think we're close to having a cyber doctrine, but we're getting there. Mm-hmm. And generally, I just feel like officials in government are opening up more about this and having a more public discussion, which I feel is generally positive because it sort of gets their point of view out there, allows it to be challenged, it allows the experts to weigh in. So at least it feels like we are sort of groping through more a bit now deliberately a policy, and that's forming. There's still a long way to go, but I'm heartened by the fact that people are speaking more about this than they were 3 or 4 years ago when I remember as a reporter, one of the great debates people were having, and people from your organization too, were out there saying, look, the more you cloak this in secrecy, the more people refuse to come out and talk about it, the worse you're going to make the problem because we're not going to make smart policy. So I feel like we're sort of getting over that hesitation and that reluctance to talk frankly about the problem.
I would just add that I think the discussion is greatly maturing and in many ways moving beyond cyber, right? The Sony discussions, I think in the Situation Room that occurred that day, were not necessarily about the cyber attack, it was about freedom of speech and the traditional national security implications. Okay, you have North Korea and their reconnaissance bureau that's responsible. What options do we have? Not in cyberspace necessarily, but through the full toolkit of our diplomatic, financial, military capabilities to actually respond. So it's becoming a national security problem, and we're starting to realize cyber is a means to an end. You look at the impact. I remember we had debates just a few years ago in DoD, do you respond to cyber attack only through cyber, or can you use kinetic means? And a few years later, they realized, of course you can, right? If your power plant blows up because of a missile or plane flying into it or because of a cyber attack, guess what? You can retaliate in a proportional fashion with all your means, JDAMs and drones and everything else that we have available to us. We don't have to retaliate in kind.
Okay, I was going to say we're ending on an up note. I'm not sure JDAMs are an up note. But let's open it up to the rest of the group to get started. Gentlemen in the second row, please. And if you wouldn't mind, as the new guy here, I'd appreciate if folks would introduce themselves when they ask their questions, please.
It's Randy Fort with Raytheon. Dmitri, I would just add one parenthetical to your list of 3 was Sony. The 4th element of that was the hacker group threatening terrorist attacks on the theaters that would have deigned to have showed it. So that sort of also raised the ante a little bit. I'd like to get your thoughts, though, on this whole issue of active defense, dynamic defense, or euphemistically it's been called hack back. Reportedly, last fall, the financial sector came together and actually engaged in some dynamic defense, hacking back against some of their the protagonists that were intruding on their networks. North Korean internet connections were shut down apparently for days at a time, subsequent to the attribution to them of the Sony attack by parties unknown, but somebody was clearly hacking back in that particular instance, whether nation state or other entity. So I just wonder, as you look now, the government has been, over the last year or two, rather disdainful, dismissive of this, but if the financial sector in fact is taking more aggressive action, then do you think this is something that is going to be more in vogue in 2015 and going forward?
I don't think so. I'm not aware of what the financial sector has done, and the reporting on that is pretty murky. The folks that I talk to in the financial sector or others are pretty cautious and know what the law is, and have expressed zero interest in engaging in those types of activities. So I'm not aware of them.
When I was reporting the book, this subject came up again and again, and I had a very interesting conversation with a former senior intelligence official who said, hacking back is happening, it's illegal, and they're being advised by very smart people who know what they're doing, and he wouldn't go any further than that. I don't know whether or not you're going to see it on the rise. I mean, the reporting that you're citing, I think it was a Bloomberg piece, was really an interesting story. But the number of companies I talked to who found themselves in the position, and lawyers too, of saying, why shouldn't there be some accommodation in the law for us to be able to defend ourselves? And the analogy that people often like to bring up was, if you break into my house and steal my television set, I'm allowed to defend myself against you in my home. I mean, most states, allow for the use of lethal force if you were in my home. Now, if you steal my television set and you take it across the street and I see it in your living room, do I not have some form of recourse to go and get the television back? And these companies, it's not a perfect analogy, but these companies were saying, like, look, our data is stolen. Why shouldn't we be able to retrieve it? And if the government's not going to go get it for me, shouldn't I have some ability to either disincentivize people from stealing from me in the first place by putting things in my network? Is that hacking back to sort of put honeypots in the network and try and infect an intruder? Is that not just self-defense? And I mean, there were people who are, lawyers who I talked to were sort of drawing the absolute lines of no hacking back, and it didn't seem to match up with the reality that a lot of companies were facing. And there was just great frustration on their part of what do we do about this? And so I don't know whether it's going to increase hacking back, but it certainly seems to me that that's a ripe conversation to be having right now.
Mm-hmm. Harlan.
Thanks. I'm Harlan Ullman with the Atlantic Council. I'd like to ask all of you, including you, Dan, because you were a strategist at one time recently. About 15 years ago, I was asked by somebody very senior in government to come up with 7 nightmare scenarios. And one of them was dealing with a national network, not in this country, to see if we could disrupt and create panic. And the answer was it was pretty easy. That was 15 years ago. I preface that because in my latest book, in one of my chapters on wildcards, I talk about a 10-year-old Bernie Madoff. And the reason I came to that, and for those who don't realize, Madoff was a great Ponzi fellow who stole about $1 billion from his clients. I'm also a director of a public company in the financial sector. And after carefully reviewing our annual prospectus, there was some glitch in the printing, and it was off by 2 digits in net asset value. That's really serious. This was an accident. You're familiar with program trading in stock markets, which got out of hand, and obviously there are buffers in. Well, what about a 10-year-old Bernie Madoff who wants to get into annual reports, wants to start manipulating the stock market prices, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? How do you see that as an emerging danger? Because it seems to me that that's an area where there probably are too many people who have what I would quote as the national technical means ability to do that. And it seems to me that 15 years ago, when we could see taking down networks, it seems to me that the next place that is going to be ripe for this sort of intervention is going to be the financial and money markets, banking system, stock markets, et cetera, et cetera. I wonder what your views are about that, and what, if anything, besides defenses can be done.
There are three types of attacks you can conduct in cyberspace. So people talk about this being a CIA model, not a CIA as a central intelligence agency, but confidentiality, integrity, availability. So confidentiality, espionage, theft of data, that we're seeing every day. Availability, destruction, disruption, those types of things we're seeing on a pretty regular basis as well. The integrity attacks, which involve modification of data where you can no longer make sense of it, or you're trusting something that's not really true. I actually think those are the most devious, and if you look at even Stuxnet, we make a lot out of the fact that it had a physical impact. In fact, much of the impact was making the Iranians believe that the centrifuges were defective when in reality they were not. So it's not that we blew up a lot of centrifuges, we did a few, but or Stuxnet did a few, but supposedly. But the Iranians had actually carted off perfectly legitimate centrifuges because they were thinking that they did not operate correctly because we manipulated the screens that they were seeing and spinning them up and spinning them down very quickly. So those types of attacks I actually think are the most impactful, and certainly getting into the financial systems and manipulating the settlement transactions would have massive repercussions on our economy, and those are the things that I worry about the most. And if you can get into those systems, if you can get into the backup systems, you could cause so much damage that you can not undo these things. And when we've seen accidental impacts from algorithmic trading, the stock market was able to react very quickly because we just said, well, we'll undo all the transactions that occurred in that period and go back to 11 o'clock when this situation started. If the data has been completely changed and you cannot undo it, that's quite a nightmare scenario.
Shane, you want to say?
No, I was just going to say that scenario is what Hank Paulson, when he was Treasury Secretary, told George Bush. That was the thing that kept me up at night when I ran Goldman Sachs. Yeah. And it was one of the threats that helped, I think, galvanize President Bush towards launching a national cybersecurity strategy.
And I will say from my Pentagon experience, the data integrity issue was a huge concern to us, and I agree with Dmitri in particular because it's very insidious in nature. It's not quite as clear as an attack that takes something down or takes something offline, and it's something that you may not notice for some time, which would be particularly dangerous, and even once you notice, it may take you a very long time unless you have good backups to fix. So it highlights another issue that I'll just raise. We can, again, let it to others to discuss as well. When we put cyber in a military context, looking at the threats and looking at the responses tends to take on a military flavor. So attacks tend to be more the direct attacks rather than these types of data integrity attacks. And we tend to think of cyber as another type of comms, for example, rather than something that really underpins everything we do. And if data integrity is brought into doubt, particularly for the military systems, but then if you think about for the financial systems and how that could have ripple effects across the economy, obviously definitely a nightmare scenario.
And I've actually argued from a military context perspective. Obviously, we're very enamored right now with cyber as a weapon, and we stood up a cyber command. I actually believe that the value of these tools in a kinetic context is actually pretty limited because the impact, again, you can't easily kill anyone with cyber attack. You can't even easily destroy things on a dime, right? It takes a tremendous amount of preparation and testing and everything else. So it's not like a missile that you can just launch, given it a bunch of coordinates. Cyber takes months, if not years, of prep to actually execute, and you may not even know if it worked or not. Battle damage assessment is very hard. But those types of insidious attacks or longer-term psyops that we are, I think, as a nation, not very good at doing, is actually where you get most of the benefit in cyber. And I worry because the Chinese and the Russians in particular are very good at using that type of asymmetric warfare and have conducted disinformation attacks and other things through their SIGINT and other capabilities. So you look at just what happened in Ukraine last year, where Victoria Nuland, our ambassador to Europe, has a phone call. It's intercepted clearly through SIGINT, and the Russians have tremendous SIGINT capabilities in Ukraine. And then they put it out on YouTube. So I wonder if NSA would ever do something like that, where we would intercept it and actually release it publicly to embarrass someone else. I highly doubt it. And the Russians and the Chinese and some other countries are actually experts at that type of disinformation propaganda.
Good. In the front row here, please. And then we have two more.
Hi, I'm Robert Schroeder with International Investor. There's somewhat of an incongruity here, and I wonder if both policymakers, military people, media people, as well as those of you in the industry space, are not partly responsible for this. And that is, there's a lot of fat and fancy in this. China has been implicated repeatedly, not just by the Mandiant report, but echoed by the intelligence community and the Pentagon, that they were singularly responsible for hundreds of billions of dollars of the loss of intellectual property, et cetera. And then we have a case like Sony, and so much attention is paid to that. But I mean, really, there's a big imbalance there. And why don't we see more people from industry, media, and others say, hey, we've got to step up and show that there's repercussions for this kind of wholesale crime being perpetrated on the U.S.? Why isn't there more policy effort to punish them in the areas of trade or wherever to say, look, clearly this is much more important than a simple corporate Sony attack?
The immediate answer I think that comes to my mind is China's our biggest trading partner, and North Korea is a rogue regime that nobody cares about. So, I mean, the difficulties, and I take your point, and I think it's a fair criticism that's been levied against this administration and the previous administration for not doing more to stand up to China about this. I think that generally there's a fear of not igniting a trade war, that there are other issues like climate change that are deemed to be more important, and this sort of takes a back seat. Indicting 5 Chinese officials is a way we can all sort of feel good about ourselves maybe, but even that, I mean, is really a pretty pathetic response when you really think about it. I've wondered in the past couple of weeks whether or not the response that the administration made to the Sony event was not just predicated on the issues that Dmitri's pointed out of free speech and the important, sort of values that the president wanted to stand up for in response to it, but because, it costs us nothing to punish North Korea. And we had good attribution, and why not look tough, and why not stand up and take a stand against them? And slap a few more sanctions on them. What half dozen are left even available to put on them? Not to sound so cynical about this, but we're clearly demonstrating where our concerns lie when we do not really punish China for nearly a decade of hundreds of billions of dollars in economic espionage, and then we stand up and treat North Korea like it's a threat to the Constitution.
So I can't necessarily change cynicism on this, but let me add one additional aspect that I think is worth considering, which is the level of proof or the bar that will be necessary for prosecuting these in some way, whether it's legal or otherwise, given the nature of the two different actors, right? Mm-hmm. So going after China is going to require a level of evidence and a level of disclosure that is quite high and quite significant compared to going after North Korea. And I think I'm probably quoting parts of Shane's book, the disclosure of those, that evidence could disclose sources and methods in a way that could be detrimental to us in a larger sense from a national security perspective. So that has to be weighed. And it doesn't mean that there isn't a frustration and a point to be made there, but there's a larger national security calculus that has to be made. Shane, I think, does a good job in his book getting people to think hard about whether that's the right calculus or not, but it's part of this equation as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fundamental problem is that U.S. industry is making a lot of money in China. I know companies are getting hacked and know they're getting hacked from China, and they make a judgment, and you can't necessarily fault them for it. At the end of the day, they're trying to maximize value for their shareholders. They're making a judgment that, yes, they stole $1 billion, but we're making $4 billion, so we're still ahead. And there are lots of companies that are making a lot of money in China. There were companies that were named in the indictments as victims of those attacks that were not very happy with being named in those indictments, because despite suffering through those intrusions, they still believe that they can make a lot more money in China and don't want that to jeopardize their relationships.
Yeah, it's a good point. It was funny. We had an interesting discussion in the Pentagon about how to do risk assessment on this piece, and we reached out to a lot of private sector folks, and they basically said, well, all we do is add it up at the end, and if there's a positive number, we've mitigated the risk, and if there's a negative number, there's risk. And from a national security perspective, obviously, we can take it that way. Yeah, I agree with that, but I will tell you, we heard that many, many times from folks. Sir, please.
Hi, Mike Coombs from DoD. Just a quick question. A lot of the things that have come out recently, post-Sony, has been a greater emphasis on information sharing. And obviously, Dmitri, you alluded to, NSA was watching some of this. Could they have shared it with Sony? My question is, for industry in general, for government in general, if you haven't got a significant level of training, trained people, good tools, good sensors, what good does the information do you? Could Sony, who had been hacked about 18 months earlier, and didn't take a strong lesson from that and improve significantly, have done anything with the information if they had been given it? So I think the lesson here is, my judgment is no. I think the lesson here is, unless there's an investment and a risk, as you just alluded to, Don, the same thing with credit cards. Right? Thousands and thousands of dollars in credit card fraud, but it's a rounding error for most banks, so they don't care. It's not worth the investment. JP Morgan looks like they made a little bit more significant investment and found some things they didn't see before. So yes, they've been spending a lot, but yes, they have a huge global network to defend. I tend to think that they put some more tools in place, got a little bit better, and found some things that were very difficult to find for the average. So I guess the question is, what do we do to raise the game to get people to take the risk seriously in the private sector? We have our own challenges in the government. Many of them are due to procurement rules. But what do we do to raise the game in the private sector? Was Sony a significant enough wake-up call?
So I think this is a great question. And I think the root of it is actually the problem that we have in that majority of folks out there, whether it's in industry or in government, fundamentally misunderstand the nature of this fight. And what I mean by that is they think of these as discrete events. The bank gets hacked, movie studio gets hacked, they clean it up, they're done. When in reality what happens with these primarily nation-state sponsored attack is that the adversary gets kicked out of the network and they don't say, well, I'm done, I'm going to close shop and move on. They say, oh my God, they just closed the front door on me. Let me go around the back, let me try the window, let me try the roof, and I'm going to keep trying until I get in because I have been tasked. I'm a PLA officer. A general just came down into my office and said, I need to get into this company. And I'm going to keep trying until I get in because that's my mission. And it's never ending. We see this all the time at CrowdStrike where we get into a company that's a victim, we do the forensics, we clean it up, and guess what? The next day they're trying to get back in. And they're changing tactics, they're changing tradecraft, they're bringing new tools, they're bringing zero-day exploits, and it's like a dog with a bone. They will not let go, and it's a never-ending fight. And the challenge with some of the information sharing proposals out there is that it still has that discrete event mindset where let me share some information, what I saw here. Well, guess what? That may help you in discovering that attack and clean it up, and there's value in that. But the adversary is just going to say, well, they nuked my C2s, they found this piece of malware, let me build something else that they don't yet know about, and I'm going to use that to be successful ultimately. And until we realize that we're in this continuous fight that's really never ending until we figure out how to make deterrence works and punish those adversaries. And the way you win is by being faster and better than the adversary. The OODA loop philosophy, we wholeheartedly believe in CrowdStrike, that you have to be faster, more agile than the adversary. You have to have technologies and capabilities and intelligence to help you do that. But ultimately, it's about bringing your best team against their best team and winning. And that includes collective team, right? So you can't just think of it as this is my institution. It's about your industry, your security vendors that can help you. But you need to start thinking of it as a never-ending battle, not a discrete event that you fought and won, because guess what? That was just phase one.
Shane.
I think there's still also a set of, on the Sony hack, a set of unanswered questions about exactly what level of insight the U.S. government had into what was happening. My own reporting to date, and it's not complete by any means, would suggest that we generally knew about spear phishing campaigns against American companies, but did not know about anything specific that the North Koreans were up to with respect to Sony or what their intentions may have been. Hypothetically, let's just say we did know. Let's just say that there were analysts at the NSA who were watching this and saying, this is about to happen, something very bad's about to happen at Sony because of the interview. As just a policy exercise, does that then obligate the United States government to go to Sony and say, listen, this is about to happen and you've got to get ready for it? I don't know. But I think that's sort of like what we're getting at with your question of when we get down to the level of how much information can you share with the corporation. The government goes out routinely and says, companies are vulnerable, protect yourselves, have a great day. And it's up to you. But if you had that level of specific insight, at what point do you go and tip off the company? Is that broaching some line between private and public that we want to keep separate? Are you burning a source by doing that? What is the intel loss gain that goes along with that? Not saying that the NSA knew exactly what was going to happen at Sony, but the more that you get down into the level of being inside North Korea's networks, it certainly occurs to me that there may be executives at Sony saying, well, why didn't you tell us something was happening? And that may be an unfair question, but I would imagine there are some people who are wondering that right now, that we have found out that the NSA apparently did a great job of climbing up in North Korea's computer networks.
And you have to game out what is the adversary going to do in response, because they always get a move to play, right? This is chess. This is not, solitaire. If you do notify, because of the intelligence that you have, that this is a malware, these are the domains that they use, guess what? They're going to change it.
Yeah.
And they may change it to things that you have no idea about.
And we should emphasize too, and I've had this conversation with officials in the past couple of days, the NSA is looking in North Korea's networks to find out about nuclear weapons programs and existential threats in the region, not about whatever grievance Kim Jong-un has with the Seth Rogen movie. And so that needs to be taken into consideration too. There are bigger fish to fry from the NSA's perspective.
Okay, I think we've got time for one or two more questions right here, please.
My name is Kendra Pengelly on behalf of the European Parliament Liaison Office. I'm curious to know, you've talked about going from an individual company issue to more of like a U.S. issue and how to take advantage of that. Do you see any ways we could create a transatlantic dialogue, and what frameworks could we use to really get that going? Like you said, with the frog in the boiling water.
You guys want to jump in?
I think we're kind of getting there now with, NATO has invoked cyber attacks as something that would trigger collective response of self-defense. So, it seems to me that that's sort of one way that, that dialogue or that partnership is happening. I think we probably have good intelligence sharing on these issues with our counterparts in the Five Eyes. I guess it's not totally in your question, but it's sort of embedded in there is the question of, could you imagine a cyber arms treaty or something like this? And I'm really pessimistic about that because, A, what's the incentive for anyone to join it, and B, how would you enforce it? Dialogue is great. Collective, self-defense is one thing we can deal with. Treaties would be something that I think are pretty far off.
This is one of those areas where I just don't think the kind of military war analogy works terribly well. Because the idea that we'll come up with a cyber treaty of some sort, interesting symbolically, but I'm not sure how it would work effectively. My friends back in the cyber policy office in OSD were working very hard with European partners, in particular reaching out for more of a public-private partnership approach for really trying to define norms of behavior and kind of appropriate actions, both actions and reactions with regard to cyber activities. And I thought that was a great approach to thinking about cyber as, again, this more complex environment rather than this kind of military domain where you either shoot or get shot sort of approach. So those sorts of things are underway. None of them are going to be simple. The public-private partnership, it's supposed to roll off the tongue. Every time I try to say it, I end up stuttering. But it's a key element, and it's extremely difficult, right? We just don't have a ton of experience in that area. And then trying to do it across European nations can be challenging as well. I'm not putting down European nations. It's just when you cross national boundaries, you add complication to this sort of thing. So I think you see those efforts out there, but I think there's still a long way to go and a lot of work to be done. But absolutely in that area. And obviously, to be honest, can't just be transatlantic, given the nature of what we're talking about. Almost by definition has to be very, very broad to go forward. There was a question over here. Yes, sir.
Thanks for your time and your information. Dmitri, this is for you. I'm Dale Myros, Carnegie Mellon. Trying to figure out how to determine impact. As most people know, Sony doesn't rate in the top 5 in terms of records breached in 2013, or Target doesn't rate in the top 5, and Sony doesn't rate in the top 33 in terms of records breached in 2014. So how do we think about characterizing the impact in a meaningful way that doesn't get drawn off on all kinds of tangents, much like much of the Sony discussion did, before it kind of settled into what its real impact is? Do you have any insight about thinking about characterizing impact other than number of records breached, which is pretty clumsy and immaterial most part?
Oh, thanks for the question, General. I actually think that you look at the physical world business impact. So Target, yeah, you had 40 million or so cards stolen. A fraction of them were actually exploited by the criminals. So the banks were able to move very quickly in shutting down most of them. So you look at the actual losses from those events and you estimate the impact of that. Obviously, there's reputational damage that's harder to estimate. Although you look at the stock price of Target today, I think it's higher than it was pre-breach. So some of these things are peculiar in terms of trying to estimate the impact. Sony, I think their impact was much more in the realm of impact to free speech, freedom of expression, and really the entire industry, because everyone was really cowed at that moment of saying, oh my God, we can't do another movie on North Korea, we can't make fun of Kim Jong-un, and that speaks to our core values, and obviously was one of the reasons that the administration took this absolutely unprecedented step. Not just naming another country, first time ever, of being responsible for a cyber attack. In the PLA case, it was just 5 people. They didn't actually accuse the Chinese government of being responsible, although the implications were certainly there. Here we said, it's Kim Jong-un, it's the North Korean government that's responsible, and first time ever, we're actually going to respond and institute sanctions. And to a certain extent, I think it was a little bit like the Paris attacks, obviously not in terms of the horrible deaths, but that was, people galvanized because of an attack on journalists, attack on free speech. A little bit of a similarity here, obviously not diminishing the impact of the deaths in Paris and the destruction that occurred, but similar type of thought process, I think.
So Clara, remind me, you have time for one more question? Right here, please.
This is Cosmidu Gina from Johns Hopkins University, and I would like to know your thoughts on regarding the public-private partnerships. I know that some European states, for example France, are taking a more regulatory approach and a more robust state approach towards this issue, and I was wondering what you think about that, what your thoughts are on that.
Well, that is the big debate. To what extent should this be a regulatory solution, and the government should enforce security standards on companies? And we've debated that in legislation, and consistently it has not passed because, in large part, there's a considerable part in that debate in the business community that resists that, and they have some good reasons, and maybe some not so good ones too, for objecting to it. What I will say is an interesting sort of data point in the history of this debate came a few months ago. When President Obama, I think it was in his weekly address, he used it as an opportunity to talk about net neutrality. And in the context of that, he was saying how he favored policies that would start to look at the internet as a utility. And that, again, this was a conversation about net neutrality that had nothing to do with cybersecurity, but a little flag went up for me when I heard that. Because the minute you start talking about the internet as a utility, what do governments do to utilities? They regulate them. And so he was not coming out and saying, I'm in favor of regulating the internet, but he was saying, I'm in favor, from a policy perspective, of calling the internet a utility. And once you do that, you create the cause and the justification for doing that. I think probably within the administration, that would be an approach that generally is favored. I'm not persuaded, as somebody who reports on this, that would work. Because how do you enforce security standards across whole industries? We can't even enforce them within our civilian government agencies. I mean, the Homeland Security Department cannot even get all civilian agencies to tell them what their network security policies are. It's astonishing. And they're in charge of that job. So there's a question of capacity to even do it. And then once you put in place defenses, we know how quickly those defenses are outpaced. I mean, after reading the book, I kind of came down generally favoring more of a market-based approach, where the incentive is going to be for companies to not be the next Sony and probably end up hiring experts like this guy and doing that, and not to endorse you over anyone else, of course.
Feel free.
Yeah, right.
CrowdStrike.
You can blurb my paperback if you want. But I think that's kind of where we're going, right? I mean, and so the regulatory question has been essential in this entire debate. I don't think there's great hope for that approach, not particularly with Republicans, frankly, in control of Congress. They've consistently blocked that. But I'm not so sure that is even the best outcome, given just the complexity of the challenge that we're talking about.
And you can't do that when you're living in the glass house. When the White House gets breached, when all these civilian agencies get breached, when the military is suffering these intrusions every single day and they're being successful, they can't go out to the private sector and saying, hey, you guys need to get your house in order, right? They just don't have the credibility to do that. Secondly, public-private partnerships, such an overused word in this town, particularly in this field. We never ask what for, what are we trying to achieve? And the few that I've actually seen being successful have actually been occurring pretty recently. One of them is an operation that the FBI led called the Game Over Zeus botnet takedown. And that was impressive in many ways. First of all, it was impressive because of how it got started. It got started because the FBI came to industry, financial sector and security industry and others, and said, which target do you think we should pick? That's not how the FBI works, right? They decide which criminals they prosecute, which cases they investigate, how to allocate the resources. Here they actually said, hey, industry, tell us who is impacting you the most. And the financial sector looked at their losses, and security industry looked at the data they had, and they came together and said, hey, these are sort of the top 3 things, the top 3 botnets, criminal groups that we think are most impactful. Let's pick one of those. Game Over Zeus became the top target. And then what happened is that the FBI and industry, and we were one of the companies CrowdStrike was, that worked together on this case with the FBI, literally for months, worked together on both investigating who may have been responsible, figuring out what we could do from a technical perspective to actually ultimately shut down this botnet, which we achieved. FBI ultimately executed that operation with our help and the help of another security company. And that was truly a public-private partnership where we sat together. The FBI had their authorities, their capabilities. The industry brought their perspective and capabilities to the fight, and we achieved a great impact because that botnet was taken out. Now, the criminals that were indicted, some of them are in Russia, and they're still free and continue to launch attacks. So it wasn't a miraculous success, but at least it established a precedent for truly working together, not the government saying to industry, hey, you're a victim, give me all your data, or the industry just saying, hey, government, just take care of this problem and don't bother me, but sitting together and figuring out how we can execute these operations together. And I think we need to do a lot more of those. And to a certain extent, I'm not a fan of just information sharing because that implies, hey, here's some information, let me throw it over the fence to you, do what you will with it. Let's share information for a particular purpose, for an action. Right. In this case, we shared information. We also shared and collaborated on executing this operation, and that was much more effective.
Right. So I think we managed to get to a point where we can wrap this up, hopefully on the hopeful note that Shane was trying to get us on. There are certainly some ways forward. I think the question is an interesting one, not only because that's one option which may be explored, but also because to the extent countries like France are going to proceed in that area anyway, and given the connectivity of all of this, it's going to be interesting to see how others react should that proceed more substantively, because others are going to have to react given the potential impact on their operations and the way they think about things going forward. Let me say most hopefully here is this has been a great discussion. I think having more of this discussion both in a public setting but also between these various elements and really talking hard about how we think about cyber, not just the discrete events within cyber, I think is going to be the most productive way forward on this. I thank you both for, in different ways, really contributing to raising the awareness of this issue set and commend everybody to take a look at Shane's book for, I think, doing a really good job in not only providing some compelling examples, but some interesting thoughts, again, on kind of the trade-offs, because this is by definition a complex challenge for us and not a simple issue. Thank you all very much for joining us here in person and I believe on the web. Thank you to our crack intern team for manning the mics and to Clara, who works with Jay Healy here at the Atlantic Council for helping to set up this event. I hope you'll join us next time. Clara, I'm sorry, I don't know what the next event is. In the mid-February time frame. As you know, again, we will start to make this more of a regular occurrence, and I look forward to seeing you there. You will probably be in the far more capable hands of Jay Healy, but I'll join you in the audience for the next session. And thanks again for your participation.
That was great. Thanks a lot.
That was really good.
Really good.
Thank you.